The alarms echoed through the academy, a low, pulsing hum that seemed to resonate in the bones of every cadet, sinking deep into their chests. It wasn't the sharp, jarring tone of a fire drill or the intense wail of a weapons test. This was something else, something darker. It was a hum thick with a sense of foreboding meant to make the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end. Every cadet knew that sound. It meant only one thing. Something had escaped. In an instant, the controlled chaos of the academy's halls erupted into a frenzy. Security squads flooded through the corridors, their glowing scanners sweeping every surface, their boots striking the floors like war drums, echoing in time with the rising tension. Doors slammed open, drawers were torn from their desks, and cadets were shoved roughly against the walls as security scrambled to locate the breach. The instructors barked orders, their voices barely audible over the crackling of radios and the scramble of feet. Yet amidst it all, the air felt heavy with a palpable sense of fear. This was no ordinary escape. This was something far worse. At the heart of the academy, nestled within the predator kennel, were three creatures unlike anything the academy had ever housed: Corellian cubs. Offspring of an apex species, feared for their lethal strength and intelligence, the cubs were considered a political asset as much as a scientific curiosity. Their parents were massive, terrifying beings, capable of tearing through armored battalions with a mere swipe of their claws. If these cubs were lost or harmed, it would not only spell disaster for the academy, it could ignite a diplomatic crisis with the Corellian homeworld, a war-ready species who demanded respect. No one had expected them to escape, and no one had expected what happened next. Noah Carter sat quietly in his seat in room 17, the commotion outside a distant hum to him. His eyes were fixed on the display in front of him, fingers idly tapping against the surface of his desk. His uniform, plain and nondescript, felt heavier than usual, but his posture remained relaxed, even as the alarms grew louder, more insistent. He wasn't a combat cadet. He wasn't an athlete, a sharpshooter, or a trained soldier. He was a second-year xenobehavioral cadet, a title that, to most, meant he was someone who observed and studied alien behavior, not one who fought or led. But Noah was different. While other cadets tensed, eyes flickering nervously to the door, he stayed still, his hands resting on his lap. His focus remained unbroken by the sirens blaring outside. For him, this was just another day, just another interruption in an otherwise normal routine. Across the room, the other cadets were whispering in fear, their eyes darting between one another, unsure of what was happening. They had all heard the rumors. The Corellian cubs were wild, dangerous, unpredictable. They had been born into an environment where they were taught to tear through anything that could pose a threat, honed by nature to survive and dominate. Losing them wasn't just dangerous, it was unthinkable. The security forces had arrived in minutes, their presence turning the once orderly classroom into a scene of frantic searching. Cadets were dragged from their seats, their bags ripped open, their personal belongings scattered. They had no time to explain, no time to protest. Everyone in the academy knew what was at stake. Noah didn't flinch. He didn't panic. And most of all, he didn't move. He knew what was happening. He had heard the stories, seen the briefings, learned about the Corellian cubs and the risks they posed. Yet, despite the madness unfolding around him, he simply sat there, calmly, hands resting on the smallest cub that was curled up in his lap. Noah Carter, the human cadet who had always been overlooked, who had never stood out among his peers, now found himself at the center of something no one could explain. The door to room 17 slammed open with a force that made the walls shake. 3 security officers stormed in, weapons drawn, scanning the room. "Everyone stay seated." One of them barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. Weapons were raised, their sensors scanning the room, sweeping over cadets with ruthless efficiency. Eyes flickered from face to face, filled with fear, confusion, and a growing sense of dread. Then they saw him. Noah sat at the back of the room, his face calm, his expression unreadable. And on his lap, half buried in the folds of his uniform hoodie, were the missing cubs. 3 of them fast asleep. The first cub, its small body curled up, claws flexing lazily against Noah's chest. The second, its muzzle tucked against his arm, snored softly, its tail twitching in dreamless sleep. The third, smaller but still mighty, nuzzled closer to his side, content and peaceful, like a house cat. The room froze. The guards hesitated, weapons still raised but no longer aimed with any certainty. A low murmur rippled through the room. "That's impossible," one of the cadets whispered, voice hoarse with disbelief. They kill anything they don't know. They don't trust humans. The cubs didn't stir. They didn't react to the armed soldiers, the shouting, the chaos unfolding around them. Instead, they simply purred. Their breaths were steady, rhythmic, a strange contrast to the tension in the air. Noah didn't move. He didn't blink. He just rested his hand on the back of the smallest cub, steadying its breathing, as if he were the only person who understood the calm that had settled over the room. The guards exchanged uncertain glances. They were trained to react to contain threats. But what were they supposed to do with this? The cubs, creatures designed for survival through dominance and instinct, had chosen Noah Carter, an ordinary human cadet, as their protector. The sound of boots clicking against the floor echoed as a figure stepped forward. A tall instructor, his features etched with age, his body rigid with authority. Commander Arlek. A Methexian officer with years of experience, he had seen wars, been through countless drills, and commanded countless soldiers. But even he hesitated as he looked at Noah and the cubs. "Noah Carter," he said, his voice controlled but firm. "Do you know what those are?" Noah nodded. His voice was steady, calm. "Yes, sir, predator cubs, Corellian." Arlek's brow furrowed. "You know they're missing." Another nod. Noah's expression remained unchanged. "Yes, sir." The commander's voice grew more authoritative. "And yet you didn't notify security." Noah shifted slightly, careful not to disturb the cubs. His left hand stayed firmly on the smallest cub's back, as though it were the only thing anchoring him to the moment. "They were asleep," Noah replied softly. "Didn't want to wake them." There was a moment of stunned silence. A choking sound came from the front of the room, a cadet who couldn't contain the incredulity of the situation. The door to room 17 swung open once again, this time with more force, a group of security officers scanning for any sign of aggression. "Permission to scan for aggression markers?" one of them asked, his voice carrying a note of hesitation. Arlek looked to Noah, his gaze sharp. The tension was unbearable, but Noah didn't move, he didn't even blink. As the scanner swept over the cubs, it buzzed once, then twice. "No spikes. Cortisol levels, low. All three are deep in REM sleep." A quiet murmur passed through the room. The guards were baffled. "That shouldn't be possible," one of them muttered. Noah's gaze remained steady on the cubs. They were safe. They were calm. They trusted him. And somehow that trust had made the room freeze in its tracks. But the real question lingered in the air. What did it mean that the cubs, predators too young to form bonds, had chosen a human as their protector? And more importantly, what would their parents think when they arrived? The ship's arrival was nothing short of spectacular. It was not a shuttle, not a craft designed for elegance or comfort, but a massive warship that seemed to eclipse the sun as it descended. The Caerlian delegation's vessel was a sight that could stop even the most hardened soldier in their tracks. Its exterior shimmered like dark obsidian, its surface shifting between black and deep scarlet as it descended with a silent, predatory grace. No landing gear extended. The massive ship simply anchored itself to the Academy's landing pad with magnetic stabilizers, sending out a burst of superheated vapor that carved new scars into the platform beneath it. The ground trembled as the ship locked itself into place, and a wave of unease spread through the Academy. The energy in the air shifted. This wasn't just an arrival. This was a declaration. No one greeted them, not because of disrespect, but because that was the protocol. You didn't approach the Corellians, you waited. And everyone waited. The cadets in the hallways, the instructors in their offices, the security teams stationed in the command center. No one dared make a move. The Academy's command wing was filled with tension. The security officers, the xenobiologists, the instructors, all crowded around a projection, watching the situation unfold. It had been mere hours since the cubs had been found in Noah Carter's lap, and now the parents, the matriarch of their species, were arriving. The stakes had never been higher. Noah stood at the back of the classroom, his hands still resting on the cubs. The smallest one, the one that had nestled so deeply into his chest, had woken briefly, its bright eyes blinking up at him with an innocent curiosity. But even in the presence of such tension, it seemed at peace. The others remained asleep, their small bodies rising and falling in a rhythm that was almost soothing. The guards, still wide-eyed, glanced nervously from Noah to the cubs, unsure of how to react. Even though they were still in training, they could see that the situation was far beyond protocol. The Academy had never dealt with anything like this. And then the door opened. It wasn't just a normal entry. The matriarch entered, her presence filling the room as though the very air around her had thickened. Noah didn't flinch. He had expected this moment, even if it had arrived faster than he'd anticipated. The Corellian matriarch stood in the doorway, massive and imposing, her height dwarfing even the tallest of the security officers. Her skin was a rich, dark hue, marked with scars that told stories of battles fought and won, of leadership earned through sheer strength. Her eyes, molten copper, swept the room, sharp and calculating. And then her eyes fell on him. Noah didn't move, he didn't speak. He simply waited. The matriarch stepped forward, her claws clicking softly against the floor, her head tilting as she sized him up. The air in the room felt heavy. The cadets, the instructors, even the guards held their breath, afraid to make a sound, afraid to disturb the moment. Noah didn't look away. He didn't bow his head or cower. He just looked at her with the same calm, unbroken focus he had maintained since the cubs had first found him. The matriarch's presence. The matriarch's massive form loomed closer, and the cubs, all three of them, remained undisturbed. The smallest one, still tucked into Noah's lap, stirred slightly but didn't react to the approaching threat. It simply stretched and relaxed again, purring quietly in its sleep. The room was frozen, save for the slow, rhythmic sound of the cubs breathing. It was as if the room itself had held its collective breath. The matriarch was close now, so close that Noah could feel the heat of her presence. She lowered her massive head, bringing her snout closer to him, her nostrils flaring as she sniffed the air. Noah could feel her gaze on him, but he didn't move. And then the impossible happened. The matriarch, the most powerful predator in the galaxy, the leader of a species that dominated through strength and fear, made a sound. It wasn't a growl. It wasn't a hiss. It was a hum, low and resonant, vibrating in the air, a sound that carried not just in the room, but deep within Noah's chest. It was something ancient, something primal. The cubs, even in their deep sleep, responded. The smallest one shifted slightly, as if the sound had penetrated its dreams and nestled closer to Noah's chest. A dangerous moment. The air in the room grew thick with tension. The guards, their weapons still drawn, exchanged uneasy glances. The cadets stood frozen, some leaning forward, their eyes wide, too afraid to even blink. What did it mean that the matriarch, the leader of a species that had never trusted anyone outside their own kind, had made that sound? What did it mean that the cubs, these apex predators, trusted Noah Carter, a human, more than they trusted their own kind? The matriarch stepped back just slightly. She stood silently for a moment, her eyes never leaving Noah's. She didn't growl, she didn't make any overt signs of aggression, but the room could feel her scrutiny. Every muscle in her body seemed to be taut with awareness, watching Noah as though she were waiting for something. Noah, for his part, remained utterly still. His eyes never left hers either, his palm gently resting on the back of the cub that lay closest to him. He didn't flinch, didn't show fear. He simply stayed calm, breathing steady, his hands still. The cubs had found him, and now they were his responsibility. The matriarch's first move. The matriarch did something then that no one expected. She took a slow step forward, her large head lowering just enough to sniff the air around Noah again. This time there was no growl, no sign of aggression. Instead, the matriarch's expression softened, just the smallest hint of recognition, and she leaned in, pressing her snout against the cub that rested closest to Noah's chest. For a long moment the cub didn't stir. Then slowly it opened its eyes, its black pupils widening, narrowing, adjusting to the light, and it nuzzled the matriarch's nose. The room went silent. The matriarch lifted her head, her copper eyes meeting Noah's once again. Her gaze was searching, but there was something different now, something softer, as if she had made a decision. The silence breaks, and then without a word the matriarch stepped back, as though satisfied. The cubs, for the first time since their arrival, shifted, slowly and cautiously, away from Noah but not far. They remained near him, as if reassured by the matriarch's presence. The tension in the room, which had been so thick it felt suffocating, began to ease, though not completely. The delegations from both sides were about to meet. The Corellian matriarch didn't speak a word as she turned away from Noah. Her movements were deliberate and slow, yet there was an undeniable sense of authority in the way she commanded the room. She was not merely a leader. She was an apex predator, her every action designed to convey strength, intelligence, and purpose. As she walked away from Noah, the cubs, still nestled around him, shifted restlessly, but not enough to break the calm that had settled between them. Security personnel stood frozen, weapons lowered, unsure of what to do with the situation. The silence in the room felt deafening. The matriarch didn't acknowledge the cadets or the instructors as she passed. Instead, she gave a single, curt nod to her accompanying delegation. A group of Corellian soldiers, tall and imposing, each dressed in dark, battle-worn armor. Their eyes were sharp, calculating, as they scanned the room, taking note of every detail. The room stayed silent, but for the first time since the alarms had blared through the academy, the tension had shifted. It wasn't gone, but it was different now. It was as though something ancient had been acknowledged, something older than politics or protocol, something primal. Noah remained seated, still surrounded by the cubs. His palms were steady on their backs, his breathing measured. There was an odd sense of tranquility about him. The situation was surreal. He had been thrust into the center of something he didn't fully understand, something no one had ever experienced. He wasn't an elite cadet. He wasn't part of any special training program. He was just Noah Carter, a young man who had always been overlooked, who never stood out among his peers. Why him? It was the question everyone was silently asking. The cubs had chosen him, a human. And that realization was both a blessing and a curse. Noah knew that the moment the Corellian delegation arrived, things would change. They had to. The entire academy was on edge, and the eyes of the galaxy were now turned toward him. But what did that mean for Noah Carter? What would they expect from him? And more importantly, what did it mean for the cubs? The investigation begins. As the matriarch and her delegation moved to a more secure area of the academy, the room finally began to buzz with a low murmur. The cadets, still on edge, exchanged confused glances. Some whispered, others simply stared at Noah. Instructors began ushering the cadets out of room 17, their faces tight with anxiety. The cubs, still curled up around Noah, hadn't stirred, their calmness now in eerie contrast to the heightened chaos. The sound of boots clicking against the tile floor echoed throughout the hallways as security forces swept through the academy, looking for any sign of biological residue left behind by the cubs. Every corner was being combed, every vent and air duct checked. But Noah wasn't alone for long. Dr. Enley Mercer, the academy's xenobiologist, entered the room with a calm that was almost unnerving. She was the only one in the academy who seemed completely unshaken by the situation. Her expression was focused, calculating, a woman who had seen it all and expected the unexpected. "Noah," she said softly, moving closer to him. She paused just beside his desk, eyeing the cubs with a mix of curiosity and professional interest. Her tone was gentle, but there was an undercurrent of authority in her voice. "Are you all right?" Noah looked up at her, his eyes still calm but tired. "I'm fine." He didn't feel fine, he didn't know if he ever would again. But fine was the word that came out. The cubs, these apex predators, had found him, and for reasons he didn't fully understand, they had trusted him. "I need to know what happened," Dr. Mercer continued. "Why did they choose you? What's the connection?" Noah hesitated. He had no answers. He didn't know why the cubs had chosen him. He didn't have a logical explanation, and he didn't know how to explain something so irrational. "I didn't do anything," he said quietly. I didn't move, they just came to me. They seemed..." His voice trailed off, unsure of how to continue. "Safe," Dr. Mercer finished for him, her eyes narrowing thoughtfully. "Yes, that's the word that fits. They've imprinted on you. That's impossible, but it happened." She turned to the security officers at the door, gesturing them to close the door. The officers hesitated but obeyed, shutting the door and leaving Noah alone with Dr. Mercer. "Do you understand what this means, Noah?" Dr. Mercer asked, her voice no longer as gentle. It was clear she was getting to the heart of the matter. "The cubs aren't just behaving oddly, they've bonded with you. These creatures, these predators, only bond with the strongest of their kind. They form connections through dominance, survival, and scent. And yet they chose you, not just any human, a cadet with no combat training. Why?" Noah didn't have an answer for her. But Dr. Mercer's questions cut deeper. "This is unprecedented, Noah. It doesn't make sense." The room felt smaller as Dr. Mercer's eyes lingered on the cubs, studying them, trying to understand the bond. But then her gaze shifted back to Noah, a flash of realization crossing her face. "You know something, don't you?" It wasn't a question, it was a statement she knew. Noah shifted uncomfortably. his gaze drifting down to the cubs. I don't know what you mean." His voice was soft, but there was a hint of unease in it. He wasn't hiding anything, he was. But something inside him shifted. There was something unspoken, a quiet truth that he had been avoiding, something that had become too obvious to ignore. Dr. Mercer continued to study him with intensity, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Noah, you don't have to tell me now, but you're going to need to talk about this. The Corellian delegation is going to want answers. Everyone here is going to want answers, and you need to decide. Will you be part of their solution, or will you be the one to tear it all apart?" The Corellian matriarch stood still, her massive frame looming at the threshold of the room as her delegation moved into position. Her presence seemed to fill every corner of the space, bending the very air around her, a constant reminder that she was not just an observer, but a ruler, a predator, and a protector. Even the guards who had once stood with their weapons drawn now stood at attention, their gaze fixed forward, unsure whether to breathe or speak. Noah Carter, seated at his desk, still had the 3 cubs curled around him. The smallest one, the one that had taken to curling up against his chest, was now awake, its bright eyes scanning the room with the same steady gaze it had given Noah hours earlier. For a brief moment, the room seemed to forget the gravity of the situation. The cubs were at peace, and so, for a fleeting instant, was the room. But then the matriarch's eyes turned toward him again. She had been silent for the past few minutes, her gaze calculating, sharp like a blade, and yet Noah felt no fear. It was as if she were studying him, looking for something beyond his physical presence, beyond his human form. And perhaps in that moment she found it. The matriarch took a slow, deliberate step forward, her claws clicking softly against the tile floor. The room seemed to collectively hold its breath. She was so close now that Noah could smell the faint musk of her scent, a mixture of ancient earth and steel, of something primal, untouchable. She didn't look at the cubs. Instead, her gaze remained fixed on Noah, examining him. Her eyes, molten copper, glinted with something deeper, something older, like she was seeing more than just his face, but the very essence of who he was. Noah didn't flinch. He didn't move. He just kept his hands steady on the cubs, his touch gentle, almost affectionate. He had no idea why they had chosen him, but the fact was they had, and he couldn't change that. The matriarch's test. Without warning, the matriarch dropped to her haunches, her massive frame dwarfing Noah's seated form. Her nostrils flared once, then twice, as though taking in his scent. The room grew even quieter. Some of the cadets, most of whom had been too afraid to speak earlier, shifted uneasily. Noah remained motionless. The smallest cub, who had been nuzzling his chest, stirred at the matriarch's approach but didn't show any signs of aggression. The other 2 cubs stayed asleep, their bodies twitching lightly in their dreams. The matriarch's gaze flicked to the cubs, then back to Noah. There was no sound for a long moment. She seemed to be waiting for something, perhaps for Noah to speak, or for the tension in the room to break. But he didn't speak. He didn't need to. His actions had already said more than words ever could. The matriarch's move. And then, slowly, the matriarch leaned forward and brushed her nose lightly against Noah's wrist. The action was delicate, almost tender, but it was also deeply calculating. It was an act of recognition, of trust. The room was frozen. Even the guards, who had been standing at attention, seemed unsure how to react to the matriarch's behavior. The concept of trust between predator and prey was nearly unheard of in galactic circles. It was a dangerous game, but there it was, staring them all in the face. Noah's fingers moved just slightly, his palm resting lightly on the cub's back as if to reassure it. The matriarch watched him for a moment longer, and then, to everyone's shock, she slowly lowered her head in acknowledgement. "So Tekvin," she murmured, her voice low and gravelly, carrying with it an ancient authority that left no room for argument. The words hit Noah like a wave. They were foreign to him, spoken in the guttural tones of the Carelian language, but he understood them even without translation. "So Tekvin," the one who shelters the bloodline. The words hung heavy in the room, and as Noah processed their meaning, something shifting inside him. The cubs had chosen him, and now their matriarch had named him. The room was still. The matriarch's presence lingered, almost tangible, in the air around them. Even the most seasoned officers, who had weathered countless interspecies negotiations and skirmishes, felt the gravity of what had just happened. Noah Carter wasn't just the human cadet who had been at the wrong place at the wrong time. He was now a protector, an honored guest, in the eyes of the Carelians. The delegation's purpose. The tension in the room shifted once again. The matriarch didn't rise immediately. Instead, she nodded toward the other members of her delegation, signaling them to approach. One by one, they entered the room, moving with purpose and precision. These were no ordinary soldiers. Each one was a high-ranking member of the Caerleon military or political hierarchy. Their presence alone commanded respect. Noah remained seated, feeling the weight of their gaze, but he didn't flinch. The cubs, nestled around him, seemed perfectly at ease. It was as if they knew this was not a battle they needed to fight. They had already found their safe place. The leader of the delegation, a tall male with striking silver streaks in his fur, stepped forward. His eyes, sharp and calculating, took in the situation before him. He studied Noah, then glanced at the cubs, still calm and resting. "The bond is clear," he said, his voice deep and authoritative. "But there are protocols we must follow. You are no longer just a cadet here, Noah Carter. You are now a part of the Caerleon bloodline. That comes with a responsibility, one that not many can carry." Noah, for the first time since the cubs had found him, felt the weight of what he had become. He had never asked for this, never expected to be thrust into a situation so far beyond his control. But now, the reality was clear. He wasn't just a cadet anymore. He was the Tekvin, a protector of a species that lived by strength, loyalty, and survival. The stakes. The room became tense once more as the matriarch slowly rose, her massive form filling the space. She turned to the others, speaking in their native tongue, but her words were clipped direct. It was clear she was issuing orders. "You are to begin preparations," she said. "We will be taking him to Orolin 3 within the next rotation." Noah's heart skipped a beat. Orolin 3, the Caerleon protected territories. It was a place he had read about in his studies, a world known for its wild, dangerous landscapes and fierce inhabitants. It was a place where few outsiders ever set foot. And now, Noah Carter was being invited. The Caerleon delegation wasted no time. Within hours of the matriarch's decision, Noah found himself aboard a sleek, black shuttle, the deep hum of the engines a constant reminder that his life was no longer his own. The ship was cold, sterile, and efficient. Everything about it felt alien, even the air. He was surrounded by soldiers, and the sense of unease that had gripped him since the moment the cubs had chosen him only deepened as the shuttle made its way to Orolin 3, the Caerleon protected territories, a place known for its harsh, untamed wilderness and the most dangerous of creatures. Noah had read about it in his xenobiology textbooks, a planet where the Caerleon species had honed their instincts and survival skills for centuries, a place where only those who had earned their place in the food chain could survive. The academies and research stations around the galaxy had strict protocols when it came to Orolin 3. Few had ever stepped foot on it, and those who did were either elite warriors or researchers, never humans, never cadets. But Noah was no longer just a cadet. He was now Tekvin, the one who had been chosen by the cubs and thus by the Caerleon bloodline. The arrival on Orolin 3. The shuttle touched down on the rugged surface of Orolin 3, and Noah felt a chill settle deep in his bones. The atmosphere outside was thick with humidity, the air carrying an electric charge. As the hatch opened, the noise of the wilds around them hit Noah like a slap to the face. The air was thick with the calls of creatures unknown to him, and the sharp tang of unfamiliar plant life hung in the air. The jungle outside was alive with movement. Massive trees loomed above, their trunks twisted and covered in thick moss. The ground was damp, and the dense underbrush seemed to pulse with life. It felt like a living, breathing entity, as if the very planet itself was watching them. Noah was barely out of the shuttle when he saw them, the Caerleon soldiers, moving with a fluid grace, their eyes scanning the environment as they stepped out into the dense foliage. The matriarch, now standing tall beside Noah, surveyed the landscape with an air of casual authority. She wasn't just here to observe, she was here to claim her territory that now included Noah. The journey begins. "Follow me," one of the soldiers, a tall Caerleon with jagged scars across his face, instructed. His voice was low and gravelly, like the rumble of distant thunder. Noah fell into step behind him, the cubs following closely at his heels. The smallest one, still smaller than the others but growing quickly, padded beside him, its sharp eyes darting around nervously. The other two were more relaxed, seemingly at ease in their surroundings, their bodies bristling with energy. But they stayed close to Noah, as if the bond between them had already begun to define their actions. The Caerleons led them deep into the jungle, where the trees grew even taller and the air grew thicker with moisture. The soldiers were experts at navigating the dense wilderness, their movements precise and calculated. Noah, on the other hand, stumbled a few times, the uneven terrain challenging him every step of the way. The undergrowth was thick with vines and thorned plants, and every time Noah tried to step lightly, he found himself tripping over roots or stepping into a patch of slippery moss. Yet, despite the overwhelming environment, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. The sounds of the jungle grew louder, the calls of distant predators, the rustling of creatures unseen, and Noah could sense the danger that hung in the air. It was as if the jungle itself had taken notice of their presence. First challenge. A few hours into their journey, the ground beneath their feet suddenly shifted. One of the soldiers ahead signaled for everyone to stop, his eyes scanning the area with predatory precision. "There's something nearby," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Noah's heart began to pound. He had been trained in xenobiology, had studied the alien predators of the galaxy, but nothing had prepared him for the primal feeling of being in the heart of a jungle that he was not supposed to be in. He had been chosen by the cubs, yes, but that didn't mean the wilds would treat him with the same respect. The Caerleon soldiers dropped to a crouch, their weapons at the ready. Noah instinctively followed suit, but his body felt heavy with fear. The cubs, however, were already on alert, their ears pricking up at the sounds in the distance. And then they appeared. Massive shapes darted out from the foliage, beasts with elongated limbs and sleek, muscular bodies, covered in dark fur that seemed to blend into the shadows of the jungle. Their eyes glowed a bright amber, their teeth sharp and jagged. They were predators, creatures that seemed to be made of pure hunger, moving with terrifying speed. The soldiers didn't hesitate. The moment the creatures came into view, they opened fire, their weapons unleashing a deadly barrage. But Noah didn't watch the action unfold. His focus was entirely on the cubs, who, despite their small size, were now bristling with energy, their bodies poised for action. A dangerous decision. Noah took a slow step forward, his hands outstretched toward the cubs. It was a foolish decision, one that could cost him, but he felt a connection to them that transcended fear. He wasn't just their protector now, he was their kin. To his surprise, the cubs calmed at his touch, their bodies stilling as Noah moved toward them. He reached out, placing his hand gently on the smallest cub's back, and for a moment it felt like everything had stopped. The predators, sensing the cubs' calm, hesitated. They were creatures of instinct, and they knew when something wasn't right. They didn't charge, didn't attack. Instead, they simply watched Noah, eyes gleaming with intelligence, as though deciding whether he was a threat or something else entirely. Noah's heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his hand on the cub. He was no fighter, no soldier, but he understood one thing that might save him in this moment: the power of trust. The matriarch standing behind him growled softly, a low, resonant sound that seemed to ripple through the air like a wave. She took a step forward, her eyes never leaving the predators. The Caerleon soldiers, still holding their positions, waited for her next command. And then, as if by some unspoken agreement, the predators retreated. They melted back into the shadows, disappearing as quickly as they had appeared. A new understanding. Noah stood motionless, his breath coming in shallow gasps. His body was stiff from fear, but he didn't move. He didn't look at the soldiers, he didn't look at the matriarch. He only looked at the cubs, still calm, still trusting. "You did well, so Tekvin," the matriarch said, her voice low but filled with a sense of approval. The soldiers, who had been ready for a fight, slowly began to stand down, their weapons lowering. The danger had passed for now. The journey through Orolin 3 seemed endless. The jungle was alive, alive with creatures that moved faster than the eye could track, with sounds that were so foreign, so primal, they seemed to crawl under Noah's skin. The humidity clung to him like a heavy cloak, and every step through the damp underbrush felt like a step deeper into a world he didn't understand. The Caerleon soldiers were efficient and silent, their focus entirely on the task at hand. They had led Noah and the cubs through miles of dense terrain, moving as though the wilds had no power over them. But Noah felt it, the pulse of the jungle, the tension in the air. The predators here weren't like those back at the academy. They weren't confined by training or rules. They were free, ruled only by instinct, and they didn't care about rank, authority, or diplomacy. The cubs seemed unaffected. They padded along beside him, occasionally flicking their ears in response to the sounds around them but never showing fear. They trusted him, and that trust was growing stronger with every passing moment. The test of strength. After several days, Noah's feet were sore, his body exhausted from the constant journey through the thick jungle. The dense trees had given way to open ground, a wide, empty space with little shelter, the kind of place a predator would find an easy ambush point. The Caerleon soldiers were no longer walking in formation. They were spread out, eyes scanning the horizon, alert. They had reached a point where there was no turning back. Noah didn't know what awaited them, but he could feel it, the weight of something coming, something that had been following them for hours. The cubs, too, had grown tense, their ears swiveling constantly, tracking the sounds from all directions. The matriarch was at the front of their group now, her massive form barely noticeable against the towering trees. Her presence, though, had a way of making the jungle itself seem to shrink. She was a beast of the wilds, and she had no fear. Noah took a breath, wiping the sweat from his brow. He couldn't ignore the sensation that they were being watched. They had reached the trial grounds, a clearing known to only the oldest Caerleon scouts. It was said that the strongest were tested here. The strongest bonds were formed here. A sudden attack. The sound came first, a low growl so deep it rumbled through the earth beneath their feet. It was followed by a sudden rustling from all sides, the sound of dozens of creatures moving through the brush. Noah's heart leapt into his throat. The soldiers moved quickly, positioning themselves in defensive formation, weapons raised, scanning every corner of the clearing. But Noah stood still. The cubs, sensing the threat, were on alert, but they didn't scatter. They moved closer to Noah, instinctively gathering around him. The matriarch's voice was a low growl. "Stay close, do not move unless I say so." Noah didn't know what was coming, but he could feel the heat of it. The danger was closing in, and his body tensed as the sounds of growls and snapping twigs grew louder. And then they appeared. Massive shapes blending in with the shadows. Their bodies were sleek and dark, their eyes glowing with an eerie, predatory light. The creatures were hunting, and they had chosen their prey. The moment of choice. The predators didn't rush in immediately. They surrounded the group in a slow, deliberate arc, moving with eerie coordination. Their movements were unnervingly quiet, as though the jungle itself was holding its breath. Noah's mind raced. He knew that this moment would define everything. The Caerleon soldiers were ready to fight. They were trained for this. But what about him? What was his role in this? The cub closest to him let out a soft growl low in its throat. The other cubs stood rigid, their eyes locked on the creatures circling them, their claws flexing. They were ready to defend themselves. But Noah had no weapon, no armor, no training in combat. He was just a human. But then he realized something. He wasn't just any human. He was so Tekvan. He had been chosen because of something no soldier could train for: trust. The command. The matriarch stepped forward, her enormous body moving with incredible speed, but her eyes never left Noah. The predators froze. It was as if the matriarch's presence had power, an undeniable dominance. But then she looked at Noah. Her gaze softened for just a moment before her voice cut through the tension. "Do not move, stand still." Noah's heart pounded in his chest as he slowly turned to face the cubs. They were waiting for his move, for his command. They were trusting him. He took a deep breath. The matriarch's order had been clear. He had to show them that he wasn't afraid. "Stay calm," Noah whispered to the cubs, his voice steady, though his hands trembled. He didn't want to show fear, but his body screamed for him to run, to hide, to survive. But he didn't move. Instead, he lowered himself slowly to the ground, making himself appear smaller, more vulnerable. He spread his hands wide and extended them toward the nearest cub. No sudden movements, no threat, just trust. The predators surrounding them continued to circle, their glowing eyes never leaving Noah and the cubs. The silence was suffocating. And then, just as it seemed like the tension would break, the predators took a step back. Noah's breath caught. The predators weren't attacking. They were watching, as if testing him, testing his resolve. His steady breathing, his refusal to panic, his calmness in the face of danger. That was what the predators had been waiting for. The tension breaks. The matriarch's low growl reverberated through the jungle again, signaling the end of the trial. The predators, realizing they had been observed, turned away, melting back into the shadows. Their presence, though terrifying, was no longer a threat. Noah stayed crouched, his hands still extended toward the cubs. His heart raced, but he didn't dare to move yet. The silence was thick, but slowly the tension lifted. The matriarch turned to him and nodded, her expression unreadable. "You have passed the test," she said, her voice low but full of authority. "You have shown that you are worthy of the bloodline. You have earned your place among the Carelians." Noah stood up slowly, his legs shaky from the strain, but something inside him had shifted. The moment had tested him, and he had made it through. The ground beneath their feet trembled again, and the jungle seemed to hold its breath as the roar echoed through the dense trees. It was a sound that chilled Noah to the bone, primal and full of intent. The predators, those that had backed off when Noah had shown no fear, were now nowhere to be seen. Instead, something larger, something more dangerous was approaching. The matriarch's eyes narrowed. Her massive form was a silent pillar of authority as she turned toward the horizon, her nostrils flaring to catch the scent of the air. She could feel the power of the jungle, and she had sensed something was coming long before the ground shook. "Prepare yourselves," she ordered, her voice deep and resonant. The Carelian soldiers snapped into position. They raised their weapons, crouching into defensive stances. The air around them thickened with the tension of an impending battle, but Noah felt a strange sense of calm. The cubs, still around him, were alert, their bodies coiled with energy. And then Noah understood. The test wasn't over. The real trial had just begun. The creatures appear. From the underbrush, massive shapes began to emerge, their bodies moving like shadows. Hunters, large and terrifying, their bodies rippling with muscle, each one the size of a small vehicle. They were apex predators, creatures that were older than the Carelians, their very presence an ancient force of nature. They had the speed and grace of beasts long adapted to the harshest of environments, and now they were coming for the group. Noah's breath caught in his throat as he saw them approach. Large, clawed creatures with gleaming eyes that seemed to glint with intelligence. They were a direct threat, not just to the cubs, but to the very survival of everyone present. The soldiers tightened their grip on their weapons, prepared for a fight. But Noah didn't reach for a weapon. He had none. Instead, he turned to the cubs, their eyes now locked on the approaching creatures. The smallest cub made the first move, stepping forward, its tail raised in alert, its ears flat against its head. Noah's heart pounded. The instinct to run, to survive, was there, urging him to get to safety. But there was something else, something deeper, that made him stay. The final decision. "Stay close." The matriarch's voice was sharp but not harsh. She had already calculated their next move. This wasn't a moment of panic, this was a moment to show strength. Noah's instincts urged him to stay still, to show the cubs they could trust him. But as the creatures closed in, a realization settled in his chest like a weight. This wasn't just a trial for him. It was a trial for the cubs, for the bloodline, and for everything the Carelians had believed. If the cubs trusted him, then he had to show them that trust was more than just a fleeting moment. He had to prove himself worthy of their belief, and that meant showing true strength, not in physical combat, but in courage, in calm. He reached out to the cubs, his hand steady as they moved closer. The smallest one, the one that had nuzzled into his lap days ago, stepped up to him. It was no longer a small creature. It had grown, its fur bristling with energy, its body capable of fighting. The matriarch's eyes flicked to Noah, and for the first time since he had met her, there was something approving in her gaze. Noah wasn't just a human anymore. He was part of this world, part of their family, and the matriarch could see it. The battle. The predators reached the clearing, and with a savage growl, they launched themselves at the group. The Carelian soldiers fired, their weapons lighting up the jungle, but it was clear that these creatures were too quick, their movements so fluid that the soldiers were struggling to land a hit. Noah didn't hesitate. The cub closest to him growled low, its small body rushing forward. The soldiers were fighting to protect, but Noah wasn't waiting for them to act. He felt a sudden clarity. The need to protect the cubs was more than just instinct. It was family. With a deep breath, Noah stepped forward, his hand outstretched to the smallest cub, guiding it toward the attacking predators. The cub hesitated only for a moment, then surged forward, claws flashing, its body moving with a speed and precision that took even the predators by surprise. They were fast, they were deadly, but Noah's trust in them, in the cubs, was stronger. The predators swerved in midair, but the cubs were already there. The smallest one, with its incredible speed, dodged a strike and tore into the creature's side with a ferocity that shook the ground. It was no longer a cub, it was a force of nature. The Carelian soldiers were moving now, covering the fight, but Noah wasn't looking at them. He was focused entirely on the cubs. He trusted them. And as the battle raged on, the matriarch stepped forward, raising a single hand. Her growl was deep, resonant, commanding the attention of the entire jungle. The predators, realizing they were being outmatched, began to retreat. Their bodies melted into the shadows, and the roar that had filled the air just moments ago was now a distant echo. The aftermath. The jungle fell silent. The only sound was the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. Noah stood there, panting, his eyes never leaving the cubs. They had fought alongside him, and they had trusted him to lead them. And in that moment, Noah understood. This was the heart of it. The bond between him and the cubs wasn't just about survival. It was about trust, the kind of trust that could bridge worlds, that could turn enemies into allies. The matriarch turned to Noah, her expression still unreadable, but there was something in her eyes, something deeply approving. "You have proven yourself worthy, Sotekvin." Her voice was low, but the weight of her words carried. A new role. The soldiers began to circle the clearing, securing the area, but Noah remained rooted to the spot. He had come to Orlin 3 as a cadet. He had faced the wilds, the predators, and the test of trust, and he had emerged as more than just a human. He had earned his place. The matriarch approached him, her massive form looming above him. The cubs, still by his side, looked up at her with the same respect. She didn't speak immediately. Instead, she lowered her head, her eyes locked with his. "You are no longer just a protector, Sotekvin," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of years. "You are family." Noah didn't know what that meant, but in this moment he felt it. Cliffhanger. As the jungle settled and the last of the predators retreated, Noah's datapad suddenly buzzed, an incoming message. His heart skipped a beat as he read the words. "The Corellian High Council requests your immediate presence. You have been summoned to the capital. Prepare to leave within the hour." Noah's thoughts raced. The battle was over, but the real journey was only just beginning. What would the High Council want from him now? And what role did he, as Sotekvin, have in the future of the Carelian bloodline? The jungle of Orlin 3 still pulsed with life, but for Noah everything had changed. The battle was over and the immediate threat had passed. But as the last echoes of the predator's roar faded into the distance, a new reality began to settle in. He wasn't just a cadet anymore, not just the human boy who had stumbled his way into the heart of the Carelian species' most sacred traditions. No, now he was Sotekvin, the one who had been chosen by the cubs, the one who had earned their trust. The bond between him and the cubs had transformed him, and in doing so, it had transformed the very trajectory of his life. The summons. The moment the Corellian High Council's message had arrived, Noah's stomach had turned. There was no explanation, no context, just the stark command. Prepare to leave within the hour. But for Noah, it wasn't just a summons to another meeting or debriefing. This was something else entirely. It was a demand for answers, for him to prove his worth in the eyes of the Carelians, to confirm the new role he had somehow found himself in. The Carelian soldiers had prepared for the journey back to the capital, a city built into the heart of Orlin 3's largest mountain range, a fortress that seemed to rise from the very bones of the planet. The journey to the capital was not a short one. It would take days, days that Noah spent reflecting on what had happened. Days that, in many ways, were a blur. He sat quietly as the soldiers organized their transport. The cubs, now more confident in their movements, wandered nearby, their eyes still locked on him. They had already begun to grow, to show signs of the ferocity that marked their species, but still they stayed by his side, trusting him completely. A final meeting with the matriarch. Before the journey to the capital began, the matriarch took Noah aside. Her eyes were as unreadable as always, her powerful form casting a long shadow over him. "Sotekvin," she said, her voice low, "you have earned the right to walk with the Carelian bloodline. But know this, the High Council will test you in ways that you cannot imagine. They will not accept you easily. They will demand that you prove your worth." Noah nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of the unspoken challenge that lay ahead. He had been tested by the cubs. He had proven himself to them, but now it seemed that his journey was just beginning. "There will be no more tests of trust," she continued, her voice softening. "But there will be tests of strength, of resolve. The High Council will seek to understand you, to understand what has happened here. And you must be prepared to show them that you are more than just an outsider. You are one of us." The journey to the capital. The journey was grueling. Noah rode in silence, the sound of the transport engines humbling the vastness of the wilds around them. The terrain shifted from dense jungle to rocky crags and steep cliffs, and Noah couldn't help but feel a sense of awe at the vastness of it all. For days, the landscape passed by in a blur, towering mountains, glowing caverns, and rivers so wide and fast they looked like raging storms. But as they neared the capital, Noah's sense of unease grew. What did the High Council want from him? What would they do with him now that he had been claimed as so Tekvin, the human who had earned the trust of an apex predator species? And more importantly, would he be able to hold on to the bond he had formed with the cubs? Would they still see him as their protector, or was he now just another pawn in a larger political game? The High Council's judgment. Finally, they arrived at the Caerleon capital. It was nothing like Noah had ever imagined. Built into the mountainside, the city was majestic and fortified, its stone walls rising high, adorned with symbols and carvings that spoke of ancient traditions. Holographic banners fluttered in the breeze, each one representing the families, the clans, and the bloodlines of the Caerleon species. As they approached the council hall, Noah's heart began to race. The cubs remained close to him, but even they seemed to sense the weight of what was about to happen. The streets were lined with Caerleon soldiers, their eyes fixed on Noah as he passed. He felt their scrutiny, their judgment. Inside the council hall, Noah stood before the High Council, a circle of elders, each one a towering figure, their faces marked with the scars of battle, their bodies draped in ceremonial robes. They sat upon thrones of carved stone, their eyes glowing with ancient intelligence. The matriarch stood beside him, her presence a quiet force of reassurance. But even she seemed to recognize the significance of this moment. "Noah Carter," the head of the council said, his voice booming through the hall. "You stand before us now not as a cadet, not as a human, but as one who has been accepted into the Caerleon bloodline. We will not ask why you were chosen. We will ask only one question. What is your purpose now?" The ultimate decision. Noah stood in the center of the hall, the weight of the council's gaze pressing on him. He could feel the tension in the air, the anticipation of what was to come. The cubs, still by his side, shifted nervously, their eyes locked on him as if waiting for him to speak. The matriarch gave him a small nod of approval. Noah took a deep breath. "My purpose is to protect them." He motioned to the cubs, their eyes watching him intently. "My purpose is to bridge the gap between our species, to show that trust can be found even in the most unlikely places." The council was silent for a moment. Then the head of the council leaned forward, his eyes gleaming. "You have shown us your strength, Noah Carter. You have shown us your trust. But there is still much you must prove. You will not be given power freely. You must earn it just as you have earned the trust of the cubs." A new path. And so Noah's journey began anew. He was no longer just a cadet. He was so Tekvin, the protector of the Caerleon bloodline. His role was far from simple. The High Council had placed him under their watch, demanding he prove his worth again and again, not just to the Caerleons, but to the entire galaxy. He had already earned the trust of the cubs, the hardest and most significant test of all. Now, he would have to navigate the politics, the wars, and the challenges that lay ahead. But he wasn't afraid. Because no matter the trial, he knew this one truth. The bond between him and the cubs, the trust they shared, was unbreakable. Epilogue. In the heart of the Caerleon capital, in the shadow of the ancient halls, Noah stood beside the cubs, watching as they grew into the creatures they were destined to be. They would protect him, just as he would protect them. And as the stars above the capital twinkled with the promise of new challenges, Noah Carter, so Tekvin, the human who had bridged two worlds, stepped forward, ready to forge a new future. For him, for the cubs, and for the galaxy that was still learning what it meant to trust.